Bob Fosse is, in my opinion, one of the greatest filmmakers of the 20th century. Across just 5 feature films, he created a body of work that is not only daring and innovative, but also nearly flawless. Even his so-called flops are bold experiments, brimming with creativity and deserving of rediscovery in 2025. And although Fosse is often celebrated for his groundbreaking contributions to Broadway, his filmmaking career is equally remarkable. He won the Academy Award for Best Director, famously beating Francis Ford Coppola for The Godfather, and he was nominated for Best Director 3 out of 5 times. Despite this recognition, Bob Fosse remains surprisingly underappreciated in the film world, perhaps because his work and his life don't conform to traditional Hollywood formulas. But his films are fearless, deeply personal, and visually stunning, with a mix of theatricality and raw human emotion. In this video, which will be one of many that I hope to do where I rank the filmographies of filmmakers that I adore, I will be ranking Bob Fosse's 5 films, exploring what makes each one a vital part of his extraordinary but tragically short filmmaking career. So, let's dive in. I once heard someone describe Star 80 as a full feature-length version of the porno theater scene from Taxi Driver, and I gotta agree. It's so uncomfortable, and it's like watching a wobbly train headed for derailment. Bob Fosse's final film, Star 80, is a haunting and unflinching portrayal of male rage and misogyny, offering a sobering examination of the real-life murder of Playboy playmate Dorothy Stratton. Based on a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative piece, the film chronicles Dorothy's rise to fame and her brutal demise at the hands of her estranged husband, Paul Snider. Bob Fosse, known for his dazzling and dark explorations of human fragility in works like All That Jazz, which we'll get to later, departs from his characteristic blend of charm and cynicism to deliver what is an uncompromisingly bleak narrative. This is a film that dares to look directly at the ugliest truths about gendered violence and exploitation, making it as vital as it is difficult to watch. The performances, I would say, are the key strength of this movie. Eric Roberts in this movie is electrifying. Just a tour de force of a performance. I kept wanting to leave the room when he was on screen, and I mean that as a compliment. Just one of the most despicable characters, and if the film is true to life, people that I've ever seen in a film. There's just enough of a tinge of sympathy embedded in the character, but when you realize the toothpaste is out of the tube, you feel that dread, and it ain't going back in. Eric Roberts embodies the desperation, the charm, and the eventual derangement of Paul Snider with such intensity that his presence becomes almost unbearable, yet impossible to ignore. And Mariel Hemingway as Dorothy captures the delicate naivete and luminous beauty that make her tragic fate all the more heartbreaking. Through Hemingway's performance, we see Dorothy as a person striving for independence and identity in a world that views her as a commodity rather than merely a victim in a ultra-grim narrative. Bob Fosse's direction, particularly his use of a fragmented timeline and flashbacks, kind of like he used in Lenny, amplifies the sense of inevitable tragedy. From the very beginning of the movie, the audience knows Dorothy's fate, and this knowledge really casts a shadow over every moment of her life depicted on screen. The film's visual style is muted, almost clinical, creating an atmosphere of dread that mirrors the suffocating control and violence that Dorothy endured. And yet, despite its raw power, Star 80 is not without its flaws. Critics have kind of rightfully noted that the film's focus on Paul often sidelines Dorothy's perspective, reducing her at times to like a prop in her own story. And while this choice underscores the theme of male domination and exploitation, it comes at the cost of giving Dorothy's experience the depth and respect that it deserves. And one of the most unsettling aspects about Star 80 is its raw depiction of misogyny as both a personal and societal force. The film implicates not just Paul, but also the broader culture that commodified and discarded Dorothy, from the exploitative Hugh Hefner to the entertainment industry at large. This thematic thread elevates the film beyond the realm of true crime dramatization into a searing critique of how systems of power victimize women. Ultimately, Star 80 is a film that demands attention and reflection, though it offers very little solace. It's an uncompromising descent into a world of exploitation and male entitlement, delivered with Fosse's characteristic mastery of craft. While it's not an easy watch, it remains an essential one, both as a cautionary tale and as a scathing indictment of the forces that continue to perpetuate violence against women. And look at that, we go from Bob Fosse's final film to his very first film. Bob Fosse's Sweet Charity, his first time directing a motion picture, is one of those movies that really needs to be rediscovered. The film is adapted from Fellini's Nights of Cabiria, but reimagined through Fosse's unique vision with his bold choreography and experimental filmmaking style front and center. The story follows Charity Hope Valentine, a dance hall hostess trying to hold on to hope and love in 1960s New York. This film is bittersweet to watch because the film flopped at the box office and kind of in turn set the stage for Fosse's later masterpieces, which I'm going to touch on in a second. From the very first scene of this movie, you could feel how creative and alive Sweet Charity is. Bob Fosse's choreography is unmistakable, sharp, inventive, and impossible to look away from. Numbers like Hey Big Spender and I'm a Brass Band are absolute standouts. The way he stages and films these sequences make them feel like little worlds of their own, and his editing style, so modern and playful, still feels fresh today. And Shirley MacLaine as Charity Hope Valentine? In my opinion, she's perfect. She brings this charm and depth to the role that makes you root for her, even when she's making bad choices. Charity has this mix of vulnerability and resilience that feels really universal. She's messy, but she's oh so lovable. That said, Sweet Charity faced a rough reception when it premiered in 1969. Critics were sharply divided. Some praised Bob Fosse's bold approach and MacLaine's performance, while others dismissed it as overlong, overly busy, and missing the magic of the Broadway musical. There's a particularly scathing New York Times review where they call it a long, noisy, and finally dim imitation of its source material. That same reviewer argued that Fosse's attempt to use cinematic techniques felt self-conscious and that Shirley MacLaine, despite her efforts, couldn't match the eccentric charm that Gwen Verdon brought to the original stage production. Many reviewers familiar with the Broadway show found the film bloated and less effective, singling out the over-orchestrated musical numbers and the storyline that felt insufficiently engaging. Still, looking back now, 2025, as someone with no relationship to the stage musical, it's hard not to feel that many critics were overly harsh back then. Sure, Sweet Charity has its flaws. Its pacing is a little bit uneven, and some of the numbers do drag, but there's so much creativity and daring on display here that it feels like those criticisms miss the bigger picture. Bob Fosse was experimenting and taking risks that paved the way to his later triumphs like Cabaret and all that jazz. If anything, the film's imperfections make it more interesting. It's the work of an artist figuring out how to bring his unique vision to the screen. And on a watch, it's absolutely wild to me that Sweet Charity didn't do better when it came out. I mean, you've got Neil Simon writing the script, Bob Fosse doing his thing, and Shirley MacLaine at the center of it all. How did this not become one of the greatest musicals of all time? And now, the film is so overlooked that finding a decent copy to actually watch online is like a treasure hunt. And it's a real shame because this film has so much going for it. If you're a fan of musicals or just love bold, creative filmmaking, Sweet Charity is one you have to see. As I mentioned, it has its flaws, but they're the kind of flaws that come from taking risks, and those risks pay off in so many ways. So sure, it might not hit the same heights as Cabaret and all that jazz, but it's a beautiful, vibrant introduction to Bob Fosse's genius. And so here's hoping more people rediscover Sweet Charity and give it the love that it deserves. Watching Cabaret feels like watching a painter work on something that starts out messy and chaotic, but then suddenly pulls everything together into a picture that's so vivid, it takes your breath away. By the time this film ends, you're left staring at it, rethinking everything you thought you understood. Bob Fosse's direction works the same way. He draws you into the dazzling sparkle and distraction of the Kit Kat Club, only to pull the rug out from under you once you've realized the darker truths hiding underneath. This film lives in its contrasts, performance and reality, joy and despair, all building to an ending that lingers with you long after the credits roll. Liza Minnelli's Sally Bowles is the beating heart of this movie. She's vibrant and magnetic, but there's a vulnerability beneath her sparkle that's just as compelling. Minnelli makes Sally unforgettable, embodying the Cabaret's motto: laugh, sing, and live in the moment, even if everything's falling apart. Joel Grey's MC is the perfect counterpart. His mix of charm and unease feels like a sly warning of the moral decay creeping into the world outside. Together, they create a world that's almost hypnotic, a place where even the audience can forget for a little while what's coming. I'm probably beating a dead horse by saying this, but what makes Cabaret stand out is how it refuses to play by the rules of traditional musicals. Bob Fosse, it appears, is never interested in giving us comfort or escape. Instead, he leans into the grim reality of Christopher Isherwood's source material, using the Cabaret's glitz as a sharp contrast to the growing darkness outside. The infamous gorilla costume performance is a perfect example. It starts off absurd and funny, but turns into a gut punch of social commentary. The songs aren't just there for entertainment, they dig into the story's emotional and political core. The love triangle between Sally, Brian, and the Baron adds another layer of chaos. Their tangled relationships reflect the instability of the time, as everyone clings to pleasure or distraction in a world that feels like it's falling apart. And Bob Fosse ties their personal struggles to the bigger picture seamlessly. By the end, when Sally sings Cabaret, it's no longer just a catchy anthem, it's a raw, defiant moment that cuts right to the heart of her character and the film's themes. At its core, Cabaret is about so much more than its dazzling performances and catchy songs. It's a bold, unflinching look at humanity's ability to distract itself from the truth and the cost of that denial. Fosse, Minnelli, and Grey bring it all together in a way that feels timeless. The themes of joy masking despair, of history creeping closer, are as powerful today as they were then. Very few films manage to entertain while also leaving you unsettled in the best way, but Cabaret does it all. I was skeptical at first. This was the third Fosse film I had seen, and I had heard so many people talk about it, but it's a masterpiece that sticks with you, glitter and all. And as I just kind of alluded to, the themes in Cabaret still hit close to home to this very day. This movie dives into how people use escapism to distract themselves while something dark and dangerous grows in the background. A dynamic that feels eerily familiar to our world and country right now. It's about a society on the edge of collapse where people throw themselves into decadence and entertainment to avoid facing the bigger problems around them. The Cabaret itself is a perfect metaphor. It's this wild, carefree space where everything feels fluid and exciting, but outside, the cracks in society are widening. Watching it now, it's hard not to think about how we sometimes use media or culture to ignore rising extremism or attacks on democracy. Cabaret really pushes you to ask the tough questions, like how often do we look away when things get uncomfortable? It's just as sharp and relevant as it was when it came out, maybe even more so. And if you haven't seen Cabaret in a while, or if you haven't seen it at all, I highly recommend going and watching it. I first saw Bob Fosse's Lenny back in high school during the early days of Netflix streaming. And immediately I fell in love, not just with the film itself, but with Lenny Bruce as a persona, as a historical icon. As someone who's always been a comedy nerd and a pop culture history enthusiast, discovering Lenny Bruce felt like uncovering the foundation of so much of what I admire about stand-up comedy. He wasn't just a comedian, he was a trailblazer. And knowing that many of my favorite comics were influenced by him made watching Lenny feel like a rite of passage. If you love boundary-pushing comedy or any humor that tests societal limits, then understanding Lenny Bruce is almost mandatory. So picture this, a 15 or 16-year-old me sitting in my bedroom, absolutely floored by this movie. The craft on display, the incredible performances by Dustin Hoffman and Valerie Perrine, the striking black and white cinematography, and the kind of kinetic editing that I thought was reserved for post-1990s films. It all completely blew me away. It was one of the first times that I realized that cinema could be this alive, this daring, and this timeless. Up until this point in my adolescence, I had fairly written off pre-1990s films as quote-unquote old movies that had nothing to offer beyond classics like Charlie Chaplin. But Lenny shattered that misconception and opened up a whole new world for me. It was one of the first films that showed me how rich and layered the history of cinema really is. And because of that, to this day, Lenny remains one of my favorite films, not just because of its craftsmanship, but because of its story and the timelessness of its themes. Lenny Bruce's struggles feel just as relevant now as they did back then. His fight for free speech, his willingness to push back against censorship, and his ultimate demise because of the very lines he refused to respect, it all is so hauntingly resonant. At the time when I saw this, I didn't know much about Bob Fosse, but over the years, I've really come to deeply appreciate how much this film reflects his bold, energetic, and often tragic sensibilities as a filmmaker. So here I am ranking Bob Fosse's films, putting Lenny pretty confidently at number 2, right after All That Jazz, which you've probably deduced by now. And yeah, I'm putting this above Cabaret, which many people widely consider one of his 2 masterpieces. But for me, Lenny is the perfect introduction to what makes Fosse such a fascinating filmmaker. This movie is raw, it is stylish, and full of emotional and artistic energy that cements his place among the greats in my opinion. And honestly, I can't help but see the tragic parallels between Bob Fosse and Lenny Bruce, 2 men who lived unapologetically, who burned brightly and left us far too soon. Lenny was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, though it didn't win any of them. When you look at what it was up against that year, The Conversation, Chinatown, Godfather Part 2, and The Towering Inferno, it's clear the competition was stacked. There's also a bit of poetic justice in how things played out. Bob Fosse beat Francis Ford Coppola for Best Director a few years earlier with Cabaret, but Coppola would take home the award for Godfather Part 2, leaving Fosse empty-handed with Lenny. What a truly cool rivalry between 2 titans of cinema. I've heard people argue that Spike Lee's Malcolm X is the greatest biopic ever made, something I'm not going to contest here. But they say it because it refuses to shy away from showing how systematic forces led to Malcolm's death. And Lenny, in my opinion, achieves something equally powerful. It examines how Bruce's defiance of the obscenity laws of his time became a fight for his freedom, his livelihood, and ultimately his life. A fight that he unfortunately lost. Modern audiences certainly don't worry about obscenity in the same way, but Lenny Bruce's story serves as a sobering reminder of the cost of challenging societal norms. The line that Lenny Bruce refused to stay behind wasn't just about censorship, it was about survival. I've heard some critics claim that this film takes too many liberties with the truth, but to that I say, who cares? The sign of a really good biopic to me isn't strict historical accuracy, it's about humanizing its subject. And Lenny does this beautifully, capturing Bruce's evolution from ambitious comic to troubled addict, and ultimately to a martyr for free speech. It also connects him to his larger impact on art and culture, showing how his legacy pushed comedy and freedom of expression into uncharted territory. I might get flack for putting this at number 2 and putting it above Cabaret. I've read online that people sort of don't like this movie as much as I do, clearly. But really, this was a movie that got me into Bob Fosse and showed me so much of what cinema could be. And so for those reasons, I have to put it at number 2. And that leads us to number 1. All right, here we are. Let's talk about it. All That Jazz takes the top spot on this list for a reason. It's not just Bob Fosse's most ambitious film, but also his most personal and raw. Released in 1979, this semi-autobiographical masterpiece is a dazzling exploration of art, obsession, and mortality, wrapped in Fosse's signature style of grit and glamour. Starring Roy Scheider in a career-defining performance as Joe Gideon, the film takes us deep into the chaotic life of a theater director and choreographer grappling with the demands of his career, his relationships, and his own failing health. While Bob Fosse was trying to edit Lenny and choreograph a production of Chicago in 1974, he suffered a massive heart attack and underwent open-heart surgery. This life-altering event marked the beginning of his preoccupation with the themes of life and death. Initially, Bob Fosse and his friend Robert Allen Arthur planned to adapt Hilma Wolitzer's Ending, a story that also explored mortality and mortal struggles. However, Fosse abandoned the project, finding the material too depressing and doubting his ability to sustain such heavy subject matter for the length of a film production. But wanting to explore these themes in a way that utilized his strengths in song and dance, Fosse turned inward, deciding to create a film based on his own experiences with Lenny and Chicago. And so Joe Gideon is unmistakably Bob Fosse's alter ego, and through this character, Fosse bears his soul. Gideon's daily ritual of Dexedrine, Alka-Seltzer, eye drops, and a confrontational glance in the mirror mirrors Fosse's own struggles with perfectionism and self-destruction. The film's brilliance lies in its ability to blend gritty realism with surreal, hallucinatory musical sequences. These fantastical moments, especially those in the hospital as Gideon's health deteriorates, blur the line between life and performance, creating a spectacle that's as joyous as it is heartbreaking. And Bob Fosse's direction is at its peak in this movie. The editing of this film, an absolute marvel, is kinetic, precise, and revolutionary. The way that scenes flow seamlessly into one another, often with musical numbers as transitions, is nothing short of cinematic genius. It's impossible not to admire the creativity of sequences like Gideon watching himself direct a musical number while lying in a hospital bed, or the film's final extravagant fantasy sequence featuring Bye Bye Life. These moments elevate All That Jazz beyond a typical musical and into the realm of high art. The film is deeply introspective, serving as both a celebration and a cautionary tale about the price of artistic ambition. Gideon's relationships with the women in his life, like his ex-wife Audrey, his girlfriend Kate, and his adoring daughter Michelle, are tender yet fraught reflections of the emotional toll of his relentless drive. The autobiographical nature of these dynamics adds a layer of vulnerability to the film that's rare in these sort of showbiz stories. And comparisons to Fellini's 8.5 are inevitable, but All That Jazz stands on its own as a unique vision. While Fellini's film is an exploration of creative block, Bob Fosse's work is a confrontation with mortality. Those hospital hallucinations that I was talking about before, with their Fellini-esque flair, go beyond mere homage. They are Fosse grappling with his own fears and his own legacy in real time. Once again, Roy Scheider's performance as Joe Gideon is nothing short of extraordinary. He captures both the magnetic charisma and the profound flaws of a man who lives and dies for his art. And despite its autographical nature, All That Jazz is universally resonant. It's a film that speaks to anyone who has ever struggled with the balance between ambition and self-care, passion and obsession. For any artist, it's a powerful reminder of the cost of living entirely for one's craft. When I first watched this film, which was maybe 4 or 5 months ago, it was nothing short of a revelation. Having already seen Lenny over 10 years ago, I expected brilliance from Fosse, but man, All That Jazz exceeded all expectations. The sheer audacity of the storytelling, the technical mastery, and the emotional depth make it one of the greatest films ever made. Bob Fosse's bravery in laying himself bare, warts and all, is unmatched, and the result is a film that's as exhilarating as it is devastating. Ultimately, All That Jazz isn't just a film, it's an experience. And I know, that's kind of annoying to say, but really, it's a spectacle, a confessional, and a celebration of the messy, beautiful chaos of life. Bob Fosse may have passed away in 1987, but his legacy as a visionary artist truly endures, and All That Jazz is the sort of crowning achievement of that legacy. And that wraps up my rankings of Bob Fosse's 5 incredible films. Reflecting on his career, it's clear to me that Fosse is one of the most brilliant and daring filmmakers of the 20th century, and dare I say, of all time. And while his output may have been small compared to some, the strength of that body of work more than compensates for its size. In my opinion, he crafted 3 films, All That Jazz, Lenny, and Cabaret, that I consider among the very best of the 20th century. And very few filmmakers can claim a track record of such excellence. And yet, despite his remarkable achievements, Fosse's name is often left out of conversations about the greatest directors of all time. And perhaps it's because his career as a filmmaker was so brief, or because he's still so closely associated with Broadway. But to dismiss his filmography because of its size is to overlook the sheer audacity, the innovation, and emotional depth that Fosse brought to the world of cinema. So I'm putting my foot down, and I'm saying it's time for a reevaluation of his work. In an era when audiences are increasingly seeking films that push boundaries and explore deeply human stories, Fosse's movies deserve to be celebrated and rediscovered. Whether it's the raw intimacy of Lenny, or the stylish decadence of Cabaret, or the heartbreaking self-reflection of All That Jazz, his films are as relevant and resonant today as they were when they first premiered. And even beyond those masterpieces, his work on Sweet Charity and Star 80 showcases his versatility and daring as a filmmaker. Bob Fosse's legacy is one of unrelenting honesty and boundless creativity. And though his time behind the camera was tragically short, his impact on cinema is truly enduring. If you haven't yet explored his films, or even if it's been a while, this is your sign to dive back in and experience the genius of Bob Fosse. Oh boy, okay. That was a long one. I've been recording this for a while. I really appreciate everyone sticking around to the end. I'm gonna just highlight exactly what I just said like 10 seconds ago and say that you should absolutely try to watch every single one of Bob Fosse's movies. In particular, I mean, obviously watch them all. There's only 5 of them. But in particular, I want to highlight Sweet Charity. That was one that I watched fairly recently, and it was hard to find. And I think that was sort of the impetus for me making this video, was that I was so annoyed that I couldn't find Sweet Charity, like a decent watchable copy online of Sweet Charity, let alone a physical media copy. So please do what you can, spread the word, and I'm trying to like maybe get a petition going for a box set or something of Bob Fosse's work, because I truly think that he is in need of some love in the year of our Lord 2025. So however you can, help me out with that. Spread the word, spread this video around, and hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out on the channel, and I will see you all next time.